From the Sky News Centre, this is Paul Murray Live.
Thank you, Sherry. As you know, on this show, we have strong opinions, but we are driven by the data. And you know I have strong views about the Prime Minister's lies and how the result is not going to change anyone's cost of living crisis. $15 a week is not going to do something for people that are needing to find anywhere between $15,000 and $30,000 extra this year than a couple of years ago to pay off their mortgages. But we get the first polls, and they are worth showing you here because they come from the lefty organisation known as Essential Research, reported in the Turnbull Times, otherwise known as The Guardian. So where are Australians on these tax cuts? Now, of course, they didn't ask about broken promises because that may well produce a finding they don't want. These were the people who didn't include, don't know, for a large part of the referendum last year. But the numbers are telling because they're trying to find the best spin, and this is the best spin that they can put on it. Now, according to the poll released today, only half of all potential voters think that the changes are exactly what should happen. Now, they worded in a very long fashion, but essentially just 47%, not even half, support the refocusing of stage 3 to being about low to middle income taxpayers. 41% say don't change it at all, or if you have to, delay it for 12 months for the obvious financial difficulties that people are in or the budget may well be in. But once you dig in even further, it is no slam dunk for the Prime Minister. Now, he thinks this turns everything around. The reality is just 51% of Labor supporters agree with what he's done. Now, remember, Labor voters, of course, had their lowest primary vote in a very long time at the last federal election. And you would assume that hardcore Team Red, Team Albo people, that number of approval would be closer to 75%. Instead, it's just 51%. Amazingly, the most opposed are younger voters, because 47% of 35 to 45-year-old voters, and that is a very significant swing vote that, remember, we talked about a lot last year, that as, this is really sort of the Gen X or early millennials, where they go matters. Well, again, hasn't broken 50%. And just 39% of young voters support the changes. Now, this is really interesting to see, because these first polls tell us that the Prime Minister thinks that the cost of you forgiving him for lying is just $15 a week. The reality is that it is pretty obvious here that what we've been talking about for a long time is the truth. The people are able to see through the spin and look at their own circumstances. They're able to work out that it is a fistful of dollars, but it's not enough to change scenarios like what we told you about last week, where huge numbers of, say, working families in Queensland are spending $200 more every week than they have income coming in, and they're amassing debt on things like credit cards by $10,000 a year. So what was all about the Prime Minister and telling his MPs that this was the solution to cost of living, it looks like it is beginning to have a very tough start. Now, we know this is a Prime Minister who was able to take a yes-no vote of 60-40 and turn it into a no-yes vote of 60-40. So he's hardly the one who's going to be able to charm his way through his own lie. But if the best headline that can be put on it by the people who did the pollster, who are polishing up a number of 47%, the best they can come up with is nearly 1 in 2 voters are backing it in. Well, guess what? Well, that does seem like, well, OK, 50 plus 1 means it's all OK. The reality is, unless it has a major surge of support, it's not going to be the circuit breaker that the Prime Minister and Labor mates want. Perfect example, again from this polling, lots of it around today. Australians believe the joint is headed in the wrong direction. They have thought this consistently for months. 49% of Australia believe that Australia is headed in the wrong direction, the wrong track, the wrong choices being made by a Prime Minister who daily shows us that he is not the man for the job. And again, interesting to see. This is a lefty poll, which is why I bring it to you in detail this evening, that 47% of Australians disapprove of his leadership. His approval level has gone down, and the disapproval level is exactly where it was when he was desperately trying to flail about at the end of the year hoping for a reset. Well, all of this evidence suggests there has been no reset. And the sales job that is currently being rolled out by the Prime Minister is not going to be effective. You see, of course, the Prime Minister has made it very clear that his word is his bond, but of course that bond is now worth nothing because he lied to millions of people about their taxation.
My word is my bond.
And he spoke so often about trust. It was a major central issue as to why you should hire him.
Trust is something that needs to be earned. But once it's lost, it's very hard to get it back. The fact is that people can't trust Scott Morrison. Who do you trust? Who do you trust? You just can't trust this government.
I will lead a government that rewards people's hard work and repays their trust.
Now, interestingly, the impact of the fall of Albanese on the question of trust has been reflected by much of the media, but there's a newspaper in Western Australia that basically backed him in hard at the last election. There are multiple seats in Western Australia that provide the government with its majority. Now, remember, I think the big bet between now and the next election, whenever that will be, is about a Labor majority versus minority. We've shown you that the seat of Tangi in Western Australia would be one of those seats that would go out the window because the majority of people in the seat are the ones that have been screwed over by the decision. But even the West Australian newspaper, which again has been very favourable to Albo for a very long period of time, its editorial about all of this was, as political porkies go, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese's tax lie was a whopper. So as the Prime Minister said of the previous Prime Minister, that trust is hard to earn, but once it's gone for good. Well, you've got to say the same has to be in and around this Prime Minister. Take your pick, $275 when it comes to power bills, infrastructure projects that they promise at an election, then roll back afterwards, and a series of other decisions that we've chronicled on this program each and every night. And I appreciate how loyal you are to this program because we follow the detail. We show you the data so nobody wakes up surprised when things end up happening. We've been on it since day one about the $1,500 that was taken off 10 million workers last year. And while much of the press gallery has ignored that, guess what they're beginning to find out? Is the same people who $1,500 was taken off them by the government are hardly rewarding a government that's giving them $15 a week back. So the Prime Minister was in Queensland today. He was on a local radio station, assuming he'd only get soft questions. He didn't. But he kind of belled the cat here when he was telling anyone who'd listen, you can still trust me.
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 Sorry, I don't know where that came from. He was on radio in Queensland today, again, saying it's okay, despite the fact that I lied to your face multiple times, more than 100 times, you can trust me.
Australians can trust me to be prepared to make difficult decisions, not the easy decision. That is the priority that I have, putting people before politics.
Sure. Of course, the entire reason why all of this has happened, the way it's happened, is because of the politics of the Dunkley by-election. If Labor loses it, then there is no chance of an election anytime this year. If they win it, then they expect the tax cut, which comes in July, plus, no doubt, something else they're going to pull out of the bag will mean they can have an election as soon as August. Again, that's the data. Follow the data, not just obsess on the politics. But remember one of the things the Prime Minister was saying last week as a way of saying, please forgive me that I've broken an obvious promise.
Our government will deliver a tax cut for every single Australian taxpayer.
Well, Terry McCrann worked the numbers in the past couple of days, and guess what? Over the years, as people start to move into the bracket creep, when they start to be charged 37 cents in the dollar and then eventually the best part of half of their wage, guess what? The Albanese tax cuts to all Australians will mean that 5 million taxpayers will end up paying more. So 10 million people lost $1,500. They now want those 10 million people to thank them because they get $15 a week back. And the reality, as the years roll on, 5 million of those 10 million, half of the people who had lost $1,500 will end up paying more. Now, of course, I know we're beyond Australia Day, but the debate, of course, is one that we know we're all a little sick of. As I said on this program in the lead up to it, I'm not going to obsess about that debate when it comes around again next year, because the data every single time tells us that, yes, okay, about 2 million people vote for the Greens, and many of those people believe we should change the date, but the extreme bulk of Australians, well, we know where they are when it comes to Australia Day. They're not at the change the date protests demanding decolonisation, they're enjoying a public holiday. And to celebrate your country. You shouldn't be forced to attend some sort of citizenship ceremony to restate your oath. You just get a day to reflect on the awesomeness of our country. Well, again, this lefty poll, which desperately has always tried to find a way to say that Australians are obsessed with finding anything but Australia Day as the way to mark our country, well, apparently, how's this? Just 18% of people believe that there should be a new national day that replaces Australia Day. So yet again, we see these numbers. In the lead up to Australia Day last weekend, we were being told about 30% of people want to change the date. Well, even the Guardian's poll shows just 18% of people actually have that position. Now, that is a smaller number than 50 last time I checked, and it's well and truly down on the same question that was asked last year. In fact, that number has gone down by 8% in just 1 year. In fact, 40% of people do not support a separate day. They want Australia Day to be exactly where it is, which is January 26. No questions. 31% say, OK, we'll have Australia Day, but if you want to have another day to reflect Indigenous heritage, this is my position, that maybe the 25th is something and the 26th is something else, that's fine. And just 18% of people are the ones who, as I say, are the ones who say we've got to replace Australia Day. So chalk this up as yet another political victory for the Prime Minister, who thinks that if he throws more of himself at an issue, then the Australian people, because they love him, will go with him. He spent $450 million speaking about Indigenous issues all of last year. He had the crocodile tears in the dirt in Uluru. The reality of all of his efforts about discussing these things is that 8% of people have walked away from the concept of a day other than Australia Day. Meantime, as you've heard, the Captain Cook statue, which is in and around the Yarra Council area, super woke, anti-Australia Day, well, as you know, bullies, lunatics, they decided to cut it down. Well, now apparently the council is talking about not replacing it. Because, you know, what do they say about bullies and vandals? Oh, but apparently you give in to them when you agree with what they do. Again, driven by the data, we got plenty of it, about just how bad Christmas was for the retailers of Australia. Now, as you know, cost of living, number one issue, always talk about it on the show because it is the number one issue in the country. Remember, even the Channel 9 newspapers had to own up to the honesty that Christmas was becoming a luxury for people because of just how much money they were spending on things like power bills. You know, the one that was supposed to be going down by $275, instead up. Well, it turns out that we spent $800 million less in the December of 23 than we did in the December of 22. Retail trade numbers were released today by the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and it shows that in every single place it went backwards to the tune of $800 million. $800 million less was being spent in the shops during a time when normally it starts to surge. It also was the same when it comes to the types of shops. When it came to your household goods, they were down. When it came to your clothing, it was down. When it came to department stores, it was down. When it came to cafes, it was down. In fact, the total was down compared to the previous period of time. Now, remember, as we told you with some of the employment numbers, that in December, 109,000 people lost their full-time jobs. The only reason the number ended up as 60,000 people overall losing their jobs was because there was a surge of about 40,000 people who picked up casual or part-time work. Now, that generally is to cover the December surge, but it's a December surge that didn't happen. So how many of those people will have held on to their jobs into January and February, we will see. But if there is literally not enough seats in the MCG for the people who lost full-time employment at the end of last year, the retail sector looks like where it is in Christmas of last year. Then we've got some problems, and problems that will not be fixed by a Prime Minister who lies and thinks that he can buy your vote with just $15 a week. Now, for those that have analysed the numbers, apparently there's a chance that some of that $800 million we would have spent in a shop, we spent online, and we did it during some of those multiple sales that took place towards the end of November as we follow the American trend of in and around Thanksgiving, the day after Thanksgiving, you're having things like, what was it, Cyber Monday or whatever it is, Black Friday, I think is what they call it on the internet now. And of course, anyone who has had a vacuum to buy of recent times. At some point in your life, you thought about buying one from Godfrey's. A company started in Melbourne the best part of a century ago, and now it has gone into administration today. It, of course, means that there'll be no more of those ads that were all over the telly for all of those different decades. And I was double-checking this, by the way. The bloke who used to do all of these ads, the comb-over and everything, he was actually the CEO of the company. He came and went from the company as CEO about 3 times, and he's been talking today that he tried to set them on the right course, but it didn't last. And sadly, the business of which he loved, he refers to it as being a tragedy, that it has now fallen apart, and with it, about 200 jobs go. A perfect example about the job losses that may still be to come. Now, an uncomfortable conversation, an inconvenient truth we need to discuss here is the effectiveness of the way the Bureau of Meteorology, the BOM, the Bureau, does things when it comes to weather. Now, obviously, it is a difficult science to say what is going to be happening tomorrow, next week, next year, but as we know, it's the only system that we have, and we expect it to work. The problem is there have been plenty of examples of when they have just got it wrong. Now, I don't think we need to shut it down, privatise it, but we do need to have a conversation about what's going on, because there's been huge rains which have been in and around Queensland for the past few days. When I was there over the weekend, you could feel that the humidity was about to break. Well, about 300 mils of rain has fallen across the southeast. The emergency services doing their best to try to deal with what have been many, many calls for help.
They all had large amounts of rain, and that triggered a number of swiftwater rescue incidents. There, our fire and rescue personnel attended to through the night. Luckily, there is no person missing. No people are injured, but there is a number of people who had to relocate from their home.
And those people that have been interrupted, of course, we send you strength and love as you try to get through it and rebuild yet again.
There's water everywhere. He's saying that he thought someone broke in because the fridge fell down from all the water. It's just hectic.
Going downstairs, bringing stuff up, because it started here, took all our stuff upstairs, but we kept going down, the water just came up.
Go Australia. Also, now, one of the reasons why we have to have this conversation is because people make decisions based off what the Bureau says is going to happen. There are people who, Victorian farmers have complained that literally millions of dollars have been lost because of the inaccurate details that come out of the Bureau when it comes to some of their long-range forecasting. And again, I'm not pretending to be a meteorologist, but remember what the predictions were for this summer. Now, again, we've still got another official month to go of summer, but it was going to be mega hot. It was going to be bushfires everywhere. The expectation was that we would have Australia's most significant bushfire season since the one a couple of years ago. We were told that, of course, El Nino meant that warm ocean temperatures were going to mean more bushfires than ever before, and I know that there have been some in Queensland, particularly some in Western Australia. But the Prime Minister, well, he in part was expecting, and his office was expecting, that over this summer there'd be a lot of bushfires, which is why he wasn't as, that he pulled his working days, or at least the appearance of working days, forward to respond to natural disasters. He didn't have much of an opportunity to do so, but he has been today in Queensland, I think he's in Townsville specifically, responding to the hurricane that we spoke about, the tropical cyclone that we spoke about last week, where, of course, one tropical cyclone equals climate change.
Well, the science told us that climate change would result in more extreme weather events and more intense extreme weather events. And unfortunately, that's what we're seeing playing out.
Bushfires everywhere. Instead, it ends up being rain everywhere. But follow the science. Of course, it is the third rail to even discuss a problem with the Bureau of Meteorology, but there's plenty of them there. We'll keep talking about them. So we make sure that somebody does raise the attention on these issues. Now, about the obsessive need to do something about changing the weather, we have state governments like the government in Queensland turning around and saying that there should be a 75% emissions target in the state of Queensland. Now, the reality is, as we've told you before, Australia is a total of 1% of the world's problem. China is 30% of the world's problem. The developing world, another best part of 25% on top of that. So it doesn't really matter what we do in Australia. Sorry, but that's the reality. But of course, people like the Teals, among others, have turned around and said we need more drastic action on climate change, we need more renewable energy. Yet none of these people, of course, are supporting renewable energy projects in their leafy little electorates. No one's suggesting that the dog park should be covered in solar panels. So, of course, the reality is that where does this stuff all end up? Well, it all ends up in the bush. Literally thousands of new wind turbines are required, all made in China. The solar panels, often made by slave labour in China, we need, 22,000 of them a day between now and 2030? Well, understandably, people in regional Australia have had enough. They've had enough of it being the dumping ground for the projects that the Teals would not have in their own backyard, for a whole collection of different reasons. And this is not because they're a bunch of knuckle draggers, but because it literally changes the landscape and it affects people's farming areas. In fact, farmers have been the ones that have been front and centre in saying we don't want this stuff. Because, as we've shown you before, in places like Victoria, it ends up in a scenario where the power lines are so low that they're not able to use tractors to actually work the land underneath the wires. But they're not compensated for where the wires are. Instead, they're compensated for where the legs of the towers go. Well, interestingly, today we learn from farmers in Victoria that there is another cost to all of this, which is not just financial, it's mental health. They want greater support networks for people whose land is being changed, whose land is being forcibly acquired by state governments who could not care less about what the views are outside of the major cities because, well, with Labor states everywhere, these are all the people who vote National, One Nation or something else, so bugger them. The Teals, of course, despite being oh so compassionate, couldn't care less about what happens to these communities, unless, of course, it affects the resale value of their hobby farms. But again, let's have a look at what came out of Victoria today. Farming groups say that there is an existing support line which is only available to landholders who are going through compulsory acquisition. However, it's scaring farmers away who need it, and it puts them through to bureaucrats in the city who demand their private information, including date of birth and address, before they're even able to get some form of mental support for the changes that are happening to their area, to their farms, to their generational land holdings. In fact, in New South Wales, it's also an issue here where farmers in New South Wales are saying that mental health problems are among farmers are rife, where the transmission lines are being forcibly put up and it is making their land worse. To quote them directly, it's not just the farmers with the transmission lines going through their properties that need help, it's the neighbours who have big wind turbines and energy projects popping up next door. And it's even the farmers who sold out to the energy companies because they're afraid about what's going to happen when you go to town because everyone else in the town will say, mate, what have you done? And that creates its own sense of stress. A few other things before we get into a great debate this evening. Looking forward to Stephen Conroy, Hollie Hughes, and they're in the man cave. It's going to be fantastic. Looking forward to the sparks flying. Sit down, grab your tea. You're going to enjoy every second of it. And the great Nigel Farage a little bit later in the show. But let's race through some things like in Queensland as they move towards the election campaign this year, and all eyes and all hopes are that Stephen Miles and the useless Labor government will be swept from power. One of the ways the LNP thinks they're going to be able to win over some voters is by saying that anyone who is a first home buyer and buys a joint for $500,000 or less, they will pay no stamp duty.
It's become increasingly clear that this threshold, which has remained stubbornly stuck at $500,000 for more than a decade, is one of the big mountains that is preventing young people from getting into the market.
Local government elections in many parts of the country, but let's focus in on the giant assembly election that is going to be in the ACT, where we learn something about the independence movement that they are not willing to admit when it comes to state or federal elections. That the network of independents that all believe in the same thing, all use the same campaign materials and to some degree are all funded by the same organisations. Oh, we're all completely independent when it comes to the federal level, the Teals. We are always together, but we are always completely apart. An accusation that was made, of course, of anyone who knows how this actually works is that they're effectively a political party. It was an accusation that was made during the Victorian election where they weren't able to win any seats. But guess what has just been announced in the ACT? A political party called Independence for Canberra. Literally, a party of independence. It's not independence, it's a party. Thomas Emerson, who's the son, I think, of Craig Emerson, and is an advisor to David Pocock, has emerged as the first candidate to run for election under Independence for Canberra, saying it's time for a change, 2 decades of Labor. But at least they're finally admitting They walk the talk, they market the talk, they fund the talk, which means they're a political party. And again, I mentioned Nigel Farage. He's up in a couple of minutes' time. I look forward to having a conversation with him, particularly about a little sketch on Saturday Night Live.
Trump did have a slight stumble this week while talking about banks, and he introduced an interesting new term called debank.
We're also going to place strong protections to stop banks and regulators from trying to debank you. They want to debank you, and we're going to debank.
I don't know what the hell debank means, but he might have to take de-ambulance to see the doctor.
Well, guess what, cutie pie? It is a real thing, and it happened to Nigel Farage. We'll have a chat to him a little later. But the debate starts now. It's in the man cave. Sit back. You're going to love this one this Tuesday night here on Paul Murray Live. Glad you're watching. Thanks for doing it. I'm excited about this. They're all in the man cave right now. The former Senator, Stephen Conroy, he's just here to help, remember? And, of course, Hollie Hughes, Liberal in New South Wales. May she stay in the Parliament for as long as she wishes. So, this polling that came around today, it's interesting to read. Again, it's the first of a series of things. A trend is not one poll, all the rest of it, right? But they're obviously trying to find the best possible bounce out of the announcement last week. The best they can do is 47% of people agree, but just 51% of people agree. The single largest demo that disagrees are young voters. And I think that's because in the same way there are lots of issues that work like this, and this is why negative gearing worked against Shorten and franking credits worked against Shorten, is you might earn 200 grand now, but you hope to do it one day, or you hope your kid does one day. And that seems to be not quite lead balloon, not quite a dead cat bounce right now, but not exactly the circuit breaker the PM wanted.
Well, when you're talking about a poll in The Guardian, for a start, we're not exactly talking about the bastion of conservative politics here or someone looking for a story that's going to be in any way slightly favourable to the coalition. And the best they could come up with is this. Like, I mean, that's when you are running to the bottom of the barrel to just try and develop some spin. But you are 100% correct. When this lie, this broken promise that Albanese has now delivered to the Australian people is an absolute slap in the face to every Australian, whether it is my 16-year-old daughter, whether it's the grandparents hoping to leave something behind the kids, that aspiration is dead. Aspiration will no longer be rewarded in this country, and we don't want to see you striving for that next level.
But also, obviously, we know where the Liberal Party's going to be saying this, lie, broken promise, lie, right? The Prime Minister is still being asked about it in the week where you're out there and selling, and you know in the cat's whiskers of Labor politics that if you're being asked the question that is the main attack of your opposition, you are not quite winning the argument.
So, I mean, Labor have a big sell to do over the next 5 weeks.
Yeah.
Okay, and I think it's going to be an absolutely fascinating 5 weeks because on the one hand, Albo is getting those questions and he's going to keep for a little while getting those questions. On the other, Peter Dutton can't tell the Australian public whether he's going to break his promise, which was he supports the tax cuts, by voting for a different set of tax cuts that is not what he wants.
Yeah.
So Dutton and the shadow cabinet have got a real challenge to try and thread this needle. And I've been in this position, I can't tell you how many times, where you've got to make it, do you pick the fight, you say, no, we're voting against the tax cuts for 80% of Australians versus 20, or do you say, we'll just let it go through and we'll tell you what our policy is in a year's time at the election?
I mean, my thing on this is it's pretty simple, right, which is where I think they should end up. We'll always back a tax cut, but we'll fight back a creep, right? However, it'll be interesting to see when that decision has to be announced. Because remember, when all of this was going through the Parliament in 2017 and then reaffirmed afterwards, Labor would talk against it and then vote for it, right? This was their move in order to create the small target that they took to the 22 election. So we'll see, again, where this lands. But as an idea, Stephen, is this the idea that the economy needs or that the government needs? I mean, tax cuts are always important, and we always know that you can spin it up to the total cost over 400 years, or you can break it down to what it is per hour, right?
Yeah.
But the reality is people get paid per week, by fortnight, by month, and I don't think the number's big enough for a huge amount of people to say life is better.
I think Michaela Cash, unfortunately, had a bit of a train wreck of an interview on KG this morning where she dismissed a $40 tax cut. which I think she will walk back very quickly.
Yes, I agree.
So the number is 40, not 20. It's 20 without the change. 40 is not bad. 40 is something you can hang your hat and says we're doing
2 milkshakes, 2 pies.
Well, yeah, but 40's at the upper end. I mean, $40,000 a year, it's $15 a week.
Yep.
So, this is not Amanda Vanstone saying, it's a milkshake and a burger.
Yeah.
But this
Well,
is
it's not a milkshake and a burger if it's $15. You can't even buy a medium-sized Happy Meal at McDonald's.
I can confirm as a hefty gent, I can confirm.
Okay, I'm going to go maybe with the Big Mac or the quarter pounder meal. Sorry, I didn't mean to say the Happy Meal.
McDonald's very recently. Okay, I have to disagree.
I have 3 teenagers. I'm there often enough as well. But that's why I know the medium size of a quarter pounder meal is
That's
about
when
that.
you know Labor's winning the argument when we're discussing which fast food option it's going to be the turnaround on.
My mistake. But, Stephen, you can spin this whatever way you like. We know that since this Labor government's come into power, the average Australian's real wage has declined by over $8,000 per year.
Well, real wages,
this
you're talking
tax
about interest
is going to provide them $800 a year. So 10% of what they've lost will be coming back to them. They have already lost $8,000 a year. Mortgage rates, mortgage and rent, energy prices, grocery prices, insurance prices, everything has gone up, and they've already lost in real wages $8,000 per year, and this tax cut at best is going to give them 10% of that back. So they're taking from one, they're giving back a little amount, but it's also interesting to know that this change is going to generate $28 billion over the next 10 years. This is not a tax cut. This is a tax grab, and that tax grab is going to be, I don't know, Stephen, here's some language you guys understand.
That's over $280 billion over 20 years. I mean,
5 referendums a year could be paid for by this tax grab. 5 referendums a year.
If you're going to run that line, please keep going.
Well,
because no one is going to take any notice. That's $2 billion
this is a tax grab.
A year.
It's not a tax.
Feel free.
If you want to say...
That's your worst line. You've got 5 of the better lines. That's your worst.
5 referendums per year are going to be gained
You're
by
the only
this
one who's
tax
still
grab.
talking about the referendum.
Oh, mate, let me tell you, there's lots of people still talking about the referendum. You know where else they're talking about the referendum?
They've moved on.
Just because you guys don't want to talk about the referendum, most Australians remember how Albanese tried to divide this country, and we have now seen on Australia Day more division and absolutely more vitriol based on the fact that Albanese has done nothing but drive division in this country. He is not interested in unity. He's not interested in one Australia coming together.
Simply not true.
It's absolutely reality,
okay.
Stephen.
And I think Paul made the point a little earlier that if you look at the polling on how many people want to change Australia Day, it's actually less than it's been in a long time.
Yeah.
Because of the referendum.
People have responded to the referendum. That's why. The referendum honed people's interest on that and realised they don't want to change it. They want one Australia.
Were the smallest and weakest in intensity.
I agree. Don't refer to Invasion
Just because
Day.
somebody... No, I'm using their phrase.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm proud of Australia. I can happily live with this
Stephen,
date.
you are a good Labor right.
Yeah.
You, my darling, are in the very small minority at the moment.
No,
I can imagine Labor right tearing their hair out at what this left-wing Prime Minister's doing.
I have no doubt. But it is very interesting, that thing that after a year, the support for the separate date and change it down 8%. All right, thanks, Albo. Appreciate a few more years of Australia.
He said he was going to make sure he supported Australia Day. It's happening.
You know what?
That's the reverse ferret. He's here to help.
I'm a monarchist, and there'll be no Republican referendum coming up anytime soon.
But let's talk about this retail numbers that showed about $800 million was not spent this December as previous December. Interestingly, on top of that, as I mentioned in the thing as well, that in the December unemployment numbers, it was 109,000 people that lost full-time jobs. The reason the overall loss was 60,000 was because there was a jump in casual part-time, the expectation being that's people getting their summer jobs, all the rest of it. So presumably that falls away. So what does that mean for the Reserve Bank? Because you have been very aggressive that the last 2 increases were unnecessary.
Absolutely.
Economists from multiple banks say, don't expect the cut. We're sort of done with the rises, though. We'll probably stick with this for a little while.
Well, 2 months ago, they were saying there were still more rises to come. Yeah. So let's be clear.
So you think it should come back down?
Absolutely. That October rate rise, that last one, was just a humiliation for Michelle Bullock and the Reserve Bank. They have sent the economy into free fall. I mean, those numbers you've just quoted demonstrate that it is time for Michelle Bullock to eat humble pie and reduce interest rates by at least 1/4 point. So no question, that's what the Reserve Bank should do. I think she'll want to still play tough. I mean, she plays to the 12, bank economists. She thinks that's her job. I've got to keep those 12 bank economists happy and not care a stuff about what the
But isn't Chalmers rigging it with a new group of people that are going to decide it?
Thank you for reminding me that she's actually been sacked as the Oracle. They're actually putting in a whole new bunch of people.
Yeah. Can you imagine how that's going to go?
Greg Combay gets another job.
Nicola Roxon.
How many jobs can Greg Combay have now?
I think we only need to go to all the superannuation funds and let's just pick all the Labor former ministers who were chairs there.
Peter Collins, one of yours.
One.
Wow, over-representation.
But do you think that the Reserve Bank, when it looks at this, I mean, the reality is that it was meant to tighten to start to get everyone to pull back. With job losses and people not spending money is starting to show the turn down. Now, whether they respond to that quickly or whether they respond to that in a couple of months' time is quite material. Not a person watching right now wouldn't want a cut, but I don't know that the Reserve Bank's going to want to reverse what they did in the next month, but we'll see.
Well, look, we've been in a per capita recession.
Correct.
Regardless of how Albanese wants to spin this and his government, we have been in a per capita recession for quite a few months now, and it's only been immigration figures that are boosting those figures out of recession numbers by a hair. Yeah. And the thing is, there are still a lot of price impacts to come. What's been happening with gas prices, what's been happening in the transport industry, the industrial relations changes that are coming, all of those are going to increase prices. So we are going to still see more and more pressures coming onto cost of living pressures onto Australian families. And then if you start looking, the Labor government in New South Wales has taken away the school support, the vouchers that were going to families that helped with back to school costs. 6:30 tonight, my 16-year-old daughter, start school tomorrow, new school. I think I might have actually thrown my school shoes out a couple of months ago.
Okay.
I could have done with a late night school shopping open tonight. But, those vouchers, those things helped every family with cost of living pressures with those textbooks, school bags, school shoes, all of those sorts of things that need to be put in place. And they've been removed in New South Wales by this government. So these pressures are going to keep coming. I don't know what the Reserve Bank's going to do. We were told Philip Lowe was the devil. Michelle Bullock was a Chalmers pick.
Now it's the deputy devil.
Now she's being demonised and we're getting a whole new group. Who knows what's going on, who's going to be pulling the levers. As you say, could be Greg Combay. Wayne Swan seems to be a favourite.
That was a joke, not a prediction.
No.
Wayne
Swan, the greatest treasurer of all time.
Yeah.
He might be coming back to pull the levers. Who knows? And if that happens, well, we may as well all just pack up and move into a treehouse.
But again, right, so the fine line here was, and one of the things we were hearing last week about tax cuts was it's not going to be inflationary. Now, I think that's because it's 4/5 of bugger all and it's $15 a week.
$15 a week.
It's not really enough to move the needle.
10% of the money you've lost getting back.
But they argued when the $1,500 was removed, and it was a joint party position, but as I've said all the way through, we all know who would have been screaming and who I would have been screaming to. If it was a different government, I think we would have got a different result.
Anyway.
But so there's this fine line about how much money you can get out there. So does the economy require a certain amount of pain until it's absolutely clear that we're not going back with inflation?
Well, that's the Reserve Bank. That's the governor's position.
Right.
She will sit there and play to 12 market economists.
2 to 3%, not 4.5%, which it is now.
So, there is no question the trajectory should be down, and it should be down sooner rather than later. Those numbers, those December numbers, are disastrous.
Correct.
And she should accept some responsibility for that because she decided to put them up in October. This was a disastrous decision. I'm not suddenly making this up. I've been saying this consistently for 6 months, as you know, Paul.
Correct.
This was a very bad decision. She should start winding them back now. And that's the trajectory for Labor. If there's optimism for Labor, it's that the economy will begin to grow more as interest rates start to come down over the next 6 or 8 months. And as I said, bank economists said no, that we don't expect this. Absolutely, after those figures today, they're going, oh my goodness, maybe we've just been a little bit too hawkish. So they get to play the game of we don't really care, we're just making a prediction. the Reserve Bank governor has to wear it.
Yeah, and of course now there's this whole system of press conferences and the rest of it. But let's talk about the aid money and the aid money that went to UN agencies, of which we learned by the day the number of people that were involved in the October 7 attacks grows. It's now, the best part of 1,200. This is where my position has always been, and it won't surprise people as a libertarian, right, which is less money as possible to the highly compromised United Nations and trying to send it to targeted aid through particular local charities or perhaps international bodies that have better accountability. But I want to ask a question about if you're sitting around the cabinet table and something like this comes up, right, and they say, all right, $10 million we're sending to the UN to do this. Obviously, once we've given it, the assumption is that the UN takes care of it. But do we have any process to actually follow that the 10 million ends up in the right place or doesn't go to the wrong people?
Well, look, I mean, the way the UN works is it's got committees. It does have some degree of transparency. Nowhere near enough, clearly, in this case.
100%.
And we should not resume this funding until we are absolutely convinced that everybody who participated, supported, this atrocity, this barbaric atrocity, are held to account. They've already said, we've sacked a range of them already.
They should be sacked. They should be jailed.
So, people who were supporting this, actively helping this, should be dealt with, and they should be dealt with harshly. So Australia should under no circumstances resume this aid until it is absolutely convinced that this agency has cleaned its own house. And if it's not, you just sit there and go, no.
But we don't hear that out of the government. We heard temporary pause because it was a lovely little callback to something else they've been previously calling.
And it was also because Penny Wong announced a boost to the funding to UNRWA when it was known and accepted around the world that people that were employed by UNRWA that were teaching in Gazan schools and employed by them were part of the Hamas October 7 pogrom. Yet Penny Wong went over and promised more funding to them. Everyone knew. And you might have said you've been talking about the interest rates for 6 months. For over 12 months, I have made multiple speeches in the Parliament reading out textbooks from UNRWA and the anti-Semitism. I have read out social media posts of employees of this UN agency. Now, we have to remember here too, the UN does have refugee agencies, but this is a specific agency for Palestinians. So why do they need that? And I'm sure, Stephen, you might have as well. I've been to the Palestinian camp, UNRWA, in Ramallah. It's not a camp. It's a suburb. There's a sports club. I went to a restaurant there. They also have monuments erected to martyrs who've killed Jewish civilians that are beneficiaries of a pay-for-slay policy. There is much more to be done on this front, and we need to acknowledge that Palestinians, many through Hamas and through this UN organisation, absolutely preach from the river to the sea, and that is the decimation and genocide of Israel. And it's not acceptable.
Gang, thank you for the chat. That was remarkably friendly. I wanted a bit more.
Sorry,
no, they got along. They got along. They got along. Go and have one, and I want to hear it in the car park. Thank you, guys. All right, quick. After the break, Nigel Farage joins us from London. Thank you for watching, and particularly thank you for watching to my lovely little nephew Elijah, who is watching us right now, hanging out with his cousins. Love you, mate. All the best to you and the rest of the family. All right, let's get into it. A member of the Paul Murray Live family is none other than Nigel Farage. Now, Nigel, how much time did we spend talking about being debanked when you were told you couldn't go and access a banking system? You named the term debanking, and now Donald Trump's starting to mention it, which means lefties like people on Saturday Night Live, well, because they haven't done the research, they think there's something weird here. Here's their joke, and then I want your response.
Trump did have a slight stumble this week while talking about banks, and he introduced an interesting new term called debank.
We're also going to place strong protections to stop banks and regulators from trying to debank you. They want to debank you, and we're going to debank.
I don't know what the hell debank means, but he might have to take de-ambulance to see the doctor.
Now, Nigel, these are the smart Alex who know everything. Apparently, they don't.
Yeah, I mean, debanking was a word that I was using last year. I'm very pleased to say that as of January the 1st this year, it's now in all the official English dictionaries. But clearly, this news has not reached the so-called comedians on Saturday Night Live who, in their arrogant, elitist, liberal way show their depth of ignorance of everything. I'm very pleased that Trump is onto debanking and promising when he's president they're going to put some laws in place. And of course, it's been going on in Australia as well, all across the Western world. This has been going on, to take away people's right to have and use money. It really is terrifying. And how Saturday Night Live can rate as highly in America as it does, given the level of ignorance, is beyond me.
Well, apparently there's 80 million people who agree with all things against Trump, but, well, we won't say anything else or we'll get kicked off YouTube. Now, let's talk here about Rishi Sunak. So he's got some sort of new system of being able to reach out to people, yet it's about as plastic as you would think. Let's play everyone the grab, and I want you to explain afterwards, what the hell is this?
Hi, Nigel. I just wanted to take a moment to wish you a very happy new year. Now, like you, I think immigration levels are too high, and I've taken more action than any Prime Minister ever to do something about it. We're bringing in the toughest ever laws to stop the boats and get illegal migrants sent straight back out of the country. Just look at what we're doing for your community. So I hope you know that today and every day throughout 2024, whether I'm working in my office in Downing Street or at home in Yorkshire, I will deliver for you.
How does this work where they've got some system where you put in your name and your address or something and then you get the personal message?
Yeah, well, he just records, hello, Paul, hello, Peter, hello, Nigel. And then they ask people, what are the issues that concern you most? And of course, it's going to be the cost of living crisis, the state of the health service, or immigration. They're the three things that absolutely dominate the national conversation on our islands at the moment. And then he basically says, yes, I'm absolutely with you. I understand your problem. And we're all supposed somehow to think, for he's a jolly good fellow. Well, of course, he hadn't quite gambled on someone hoaxing him with my name. Now, we can all get hoaxed. That can happen in public life. But for him to say he's concerned about levels of immigration when last year's legal immigration figure, legal net figure, was 750,000, a record in the history of the country, just shows you he is a fraud at every level. He's trying to deceive you into thinking he's on your side. He's lying, and he's about to head for the most catastrophic election defeat ever seen by a Conservative Party in Britain, and he deserves it.
But those Conservative voters, they may not want to go back to Labor. If only there may be another option.
Well, we'll have to see. There is another party called Reform, of which at the moment I'm just the honorary president, although I did found the party in the first place. And they are creeping up in the polls, so you'll have to watch this space.
Well done, by the way, in the cricket, England beating India.
Well, England beat India. India haven't lost a series at home for 10 years. We were 190 runs behind after the first innings. A big fight back. A rookie bowler takes 7 wickets and we win. Unbelievable. But the West Indies going to Brisbane. Everyone's saying, what's the point of the Windies coming to Australia? It's going to be a whitewash. And they beat Australia in a test match by 8 runs, again with a rookie taking 7 wickets. And for those of us that love sport, it's the sheer unpredictability of it. 2 great games over the weekend.
Bloody oath. Glad you enjoyed both. All right, we'll talk to you again next week. Thank you, mate. Nigel Farage, you can see him on GB News in the UK, which is, of course, available via the Flash app here at flashnews.com.au. Plenty more to talk about. 5 minutes to go before the late debate kicks off here on Sky News. Hey, that's our show, but did you know Sky News has a brand new app? It's got great features when it comes to news or all of the programs that you like. Find it on the Apple or the Google stores, wherever you get your normal apps. And while you're there, make sure that you sign up for the $5 subscription, which means you're able to find the videos on your phone and show them to your mates. Here's the late debate. We'll see you tomorrow night for Megyn Kelly.